The mansion was silent that night, save for the faint ticking of the grand clock in the hallway. Richard Allen, a self-made millionaire, had just returned from a late meeting. His shoes echoed across the marble floor as he placed his briefcase down and loosened his tie. For a man who owned everything others dreamed of, wealth, cars, and properties, he carried a heart that often felt unbearably empty. As he poured himself a glass of water, a sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the creak of wood or the hum of machines. It was laughter. Faint, innocent, and pure, floating down from upstairs. Richard froze. For years, his home had been nothing but a quiet palace, lifeless despite its grandeur. Yet tonight the air was alive with joy. Curiosity tugged at him. Slowly, he ascended the spiral staircase, the sound growing clearer. He followed it down the corridor until he reached the room of his daughter, Emily. She was 12 years old, confined to a wheelchair since birth. Her condition had kept her fragile, often withdrawn, and Richard, though he loved her, struggled to bridge the gap between his world of boardrooms and her world of silence. When he reached the door, what he saw made his breath catch. Inside, the maid, Clara, a quiet woman in her 30s who had worked for him only 6 months, was twirling clumsily around the room. She was dancing, spinning as though she were on a grand stage. Emily sat in her chair, clapping, her face glowing with the kind of joy Richard had not seen in years. Clara bowed dramatically, and Emily's laughter rang like bells. Richard's chest tightened. He had built empires, conquered markets, and sat among the most powerful men in the city, but in that moment he realized he had failed at the one thing that mattered most: bringing light into his daughter's life. Watching his maid dance for Emily, he trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming wave of guilt and gratitude that consumed him. For years, Emily had begged him to spend more time with her. But Richard always answered with excuses. After this project, or when I'm less busy. He believed giving her the finest clothes, the best doctors, and a luxurious home was enough. Yet here was Clara, a woman with no fortune, no grand titles, offering Emily something he could not: laughter. That night, Richard could not sleep. He lay awake, haunted by the image of his daughter's radiant smile. The next morning, instead of rushing to his office, he stayed home. He asked Clara about her bond with Emily. At first, Clara was nervous, thinking she might be in trouble. But Richard reassured her. She confessed that when she first arrived, she noticed Emily's loneliness. "She doesn't need riches," Clara said softly. "She needs moments. Moments that make her feel alive." Her words pierced Richard's soul. For the first time, he realized money could buy comfort but not connection. Days turned into weeks, and Richard began to change. He canceled unnecessary meetings and started spending evenings with Emily. At first, it was awkward. He didn't know how to talk to her without sounding like a businessman giving a speech. But Emily, with a child's forgiving heart, welcomed his efforts. They read books together, played simple games, and sometimes just sat on the balcony watching sunsets. The greatest challenge for Richard was learning vulnerability. He had built walls around himself, believing emotions were weakness. But Emily, fragile yet strong in spirit, taught him otherwise. Every time he made her laugh, every time she rested her head against his shoulder, those walls began to crumble. Clara remained a quiet guide in the background, reminding Richard of the little things. How Emily loved stories at bedtime, how she lit up when someone danced, how she longed not for luxury but for love. Clara, too, carried her own struggles. She was a widow raising a young son on her own. Taking this job was her way of surviving. Yet, in giving Emily joy, she also healed a part of herself. But not every day was easy. Emily's health often wavered, and Richard feared losing her. On one difficult night, when Emily's breathing grew weak, Richard sat by her side, holding her hand with tears streaming down his face. "I would give all my wealth," he whispered, "just to keep this smile alive." That night he understood the true value of love, something that no empire could ever buy. Slowly, Richard's world transformed. His mansion, once a hollow shell, filled with warmth. He opened his home not just to Emily, but to Clara's son, treating him like family. He began funding programs for children with disabilities, ensuring that no child would feel forgotten the way Emily once had. His company also changed. He encouraged his employees to put family first, offering more time for what truly mattered. Years later, people would ask Richard about the turning point in his life, and he would always tell the same story, not about his biggest deal or his greatest victory, but about the night he walked upstairs and saw his maid dancing with his daughter. That moment taught him that wealth is meaningless without love, that laughter is the most priceless treasure, and that sometimes the people we overlook carry the greatest wisdom. And so, the millionaire who once measured his worth in numbers discovered a new kind of fortune, one found not in banks or boardrooms, but in the laughter of his little girl, in the kindness of a maid, and in the power of simple human connection. The night was unusually quiet in the Allen mansion, the kind of silence that almost feels heavy, as if the walls themselves are holding secrets. Richard Allen, the man who owned it all, returned home exhausted from a meeting that stretched later than expected. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor as he walked through the grand hallway, his shoulders slouched under the weight of yet another day filled with contracts, numbers, and negotiations. Though he had everything a man could dream of, his heart was distant, untouched by the warmth of a family life he had once imagined. He poured himself a glass of water and sat in the lounge, staring blankly at the glittering chandelier above until something unusual broke through the silence. A sound, not just any sound, but laughter, light, pure, and filled with life. He froze, glass still in his hand, listening carefully. It came again, this time clearer, a child's laughter rising up like music from the upper floor. His brow furrowed. For years, the mansion had been cloaked in quietness, the kind of quiet that spoke of absence rather than peace. Emily, his 12-year-old daughter, rarely made such joyful sounds. Confined to her wheelchair since birth, Emily was often shy, withdrawn, and quiet, her fragility making her more like a porcelain doll than the lively child Richard sometimes longed her to be. And yet tonight, there was no mistaking it. Her voice was alive with joy, something he hadn't heard in so long. Drawn by curiosity, he slowly began to climb the grand staircase, each step taken with a sense of wonder and unease. The laughter grew louder, richer, as he neared her room. He hesitated outside the door, afraid the moment might vanish if he opened it too soon. Carefully, he pushed it open, and what he saw rooted him to the spot. There, in the center of Emily's room, was Clara, the maid who had only been with them for 6 months. Clara, usually so quiet and reserved, was dancing, twirling clumsily but gracefully across the carpet as though the room were her stage. Her arms stretched wide, her steps exaggerated, and her face lit up with a smile so genuine that even the dull walls seemed to brighten. Sitting in her wheelchair, Emily clapped her hands and laughed uncontrollably, her eyes sparkling in a way Richard hadn't seen since she was a toddler. Clara spun, stumbled, then bowed dramatically, and Emily's laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. In that instant, Richard's chest tightened. His heart trembled, his breath caught, and his hands shook ever so slightly as the weight of realization sank deep into him. For years, he had believed that providing for Emily meant surrounding her with the finest doctors, the most expensive clothes, and every luxury money could buy. He had convinced himself that these things were enough, that they were proof of his love. Yet here was a woman of modest means, with no riches or titles, giving his daughter something he never could. Laughter. Clara had done in one evening what he, despite all his wealth, had failed to do for 12 long years. The sight struck him harder than any business defeat or financial loss ever could. He trembled not out of fear, but out of guilt, out of the overwhelming recognition that he had been absent from the moments that truly mattered. His daughter's joy, raw and unguarded, reminded him of all the times he had chosen work over family, deals over dinners, and meetings over moments. He felt as though he had stumbled upon a truth that had been in front of him all along, one he had been too blind, too proud to see. The mansion he had built into a palace of luxury had never been a home, not in the way Emily needed it to be. And it took a maid's dance to reveal to him the emptiness he had been living with. As Richard stood in the doorway, watching, something within him shifted. Clara twirled again, her laughter mingling with Emily's, and the room seemed to pulse with life, as if joy itself had chosen to dwell there for the night. Richard realized how fragile, how fleeting these moments could be. He could lose money and earn it back, but what about time with his daughter? Every day that passed was a day he could never reclaim, and while he had been busy building his empire, Emily had been waiting for ladder, for companionship, for her father to see her not as someone fragile to protect with riches, but as a little girl longing for love. Richard trembled at the depth of that truth. He knew he could buy the world if he wanted, but standing there in that doorway, he understood something with piercing clarity. He could not buy the sound of his daughter's laughter. He could not buy the glow on her face as she clapped for Clara's playful performance. He could not buy the bond that had formed between Emily and Clara in the quiet hours when he was away chasing profits. The moment felt sacred, like a revelation meant to change him forever. Clara was no longer just a maid, she was the light bearer who had reminded his daughter how to laugh, and in doing so, reminded him what it meant to truly live. His trembling grew stronger, not from weakness but from awakening. He realized that for the first time in years he wanted to step into that room, not as a distant provider, but as a father willing to learn, willing to feel, willing to share in the dance of life his daughter had been waiting for all along. Richard had always been the kind of man who believed in results, numbers, and the tangible proof of success. From a very young age, he had been driven by the hunger to rise above the poverty of his childhood, to never again feel the sting of lacking what others had. That hunger grew into ambition, and ambition grew into empire. By the time he was 40, he was counted among the wealthiest men in the city. He owned a chain of luxury hotels, his name commanded respect in financial circles, and people often introduced him as the man who had turned dust into diamonds. For the world, Richard was the image of success. But in the quiet corners of his life, where cameras and praise could not reach, the truth lived in silence. It was a truth that no wealth could mask. That money, no matter how much, could never fill the void of love left unattended. The night he heard Emily's laughter and saw Clara dancing was the beginning of a crack in his carefully constructed world. For the first time, he began to look at the treasures he had surrounded himself with and found them lacking. His daughter's joy was not born from the expensive gifts he had given her over the years. She did not laugh when he sent home custom-made dolls or gadgets worth thousands. Those things sat untouched on her shelves, gathering dust like relics of a life she did not want. What made her laugh, what made her eyes glow with life, was a simple dance performed by a maid who had nothing to offer except her time, her effort, and her presence. Richard had spent years thinking that love could be translated into material offerings, but that single moment taught him that wealth could not replace love, laughter, and presence. For years, Emily had begged him in subtle ways. She had asked if he could read to her at night. She had asked if he could watch her draw. She had asked if he could sit beside her while she played her favorite songs. Each time, Richard had replied with promises that were swallowed by his endless work. He thought she would understand, that one day she would see he had been busy building a future for her. But Emily had not wanted a future lined with gold. She had wanted moments. She had wanted him, his presence. His arms around her when she felt fragile. His laughter echoing alongside hers when she found joy in small things. But instead, she got absence disguised as responsibility. It became painfully clear to him that love has its own language, one that cannot be spoken with checks, signatures, or luxury. Love is spoken in attention, in eye contact, in laughter shared without watching the clock. Love is spoken when someone chooses to be there, not just in body but in spirit. Clara understood that instinctively without needing wealth to back her up. She showed up for Emily, not with diamonds, but with dance. She gave Emily her time, her energy, and her joy, and in return Emily bloomed. Richard thought back to the many times he had walked past Emily's room, too preoccupied with calls and deadlines to notice the sadness in her silence. He remembered how she had often smiled faintly at him when he left, hiding her disappointment so he wouldn't feel guilty. That smile haunted him now because he realized it had been the smile of a child who had accepted her loneliness, who had resigned herself to a father who could never seem to stay. It was not cruelty on his part but blindness, a blindness caused by the illusion that wealth would eventually make up for the absence of his love. The truth weighed on him heavily. He could not buy back the years he had lost. He could not pay money to rewind the clock and hear the laughter he had missed. He could not hire anyone to feel the closeness of his daughter's hand in his when she was younger. Those moments were gone, forever etched in the past, and his wealth had no power there. The empire he had built suddenly seemed hollow because it had been built at the cost of laughter, warmth, and connection. In the days that followed, Richard struggled with this new understanding. It was not easy to change overnight, not easy to let go of a lifetime of habits shaped by ambition. There were times when he still reached for his phone when Emily wanted to talk, times when he caught himself drifting into thoughts of profit margins instead of listening to her stories. But now, unlike before, he noticed. He saw the disappointment in her eyes when he became distracted, and he corrected himself, setting the phone aside, forcing his focus back to her. He realized that love was not about grand gestures but about consistency, about showing up every single day in ways that mattered. The more time he spent with Emily, the more he understood how wrong he had been. She did not care about the world outside her window. She did not care about how many hotels he owned or how many business magazines printed his name. She cared about whether he was present when she needed him, whether he laughed at her silly jokes, whether he sat long enough to watch the stars with her. It humbled him to know that all along, the thing she had wanted most from him was something that cost nothing. One evening, he tried to surprise her with an expensive gift, a necklace with her initials crafted in diamonds. Emily smiled politely and thanked him, but her eyes did not light up the way they did when Clara spun across the room, or when he simply held her hand and asked about her day. That necklace, though beautiful, ended up in her drawer like the others, proof once more that wealth could not replace the love she yearned for. It dawned on Richard that the presence of love, laughter, and connection could make even the smallest house feel like a palace, while the absence of them could turn a mansion into a prison. His home had been a cold, hollow place until Clara's dance breathed life into it, until Emily's laughter filled its halls again. What made it warm was not the architecture, not the furniture, not the luxury. It was the people, the moments, the presence of hearts connected to one another. Every day he felt the tension between the man he had been and the father he wanted to become. His wealth had once been his pride, but now it was only a reminder that he had missed so much. Yet he also began to see it differently. Perhaps it could be redirected, not as a replacement for love, but as a tool to create more space for it. He started using his resources to make time, to step back from endless meetings, to build a life where he could be both successful and present. Because in the end, the laughter of his daughter mattered more than any applause from the world. Clara had never thought her presence in the mansion would matter beyond her duties. She came each day with quiet determination, moving through the halls with humility, making sure everything was in order. To Richard, she had been just another employee at first, another name on the payroll. She was punctual, efficient, and respectful, never overstepping her boundaries. But within her lived a warmth, a gentleness born out of her own struggles, and it was that very warmth that began to weave its way into Emily's life. While Richard was away in his world of boardrooms and signatures, Clara began to notice the silence in Emily's days. She noticed how the girl sat by her window, watching the outside world with longing, her wheelchair positioned like a barrier between her and the life she wished she could run into. Clara saw the way Emily's eyes followed people when they laughed, the way her small fingers fidgeted with the armrest of her chair when the house felt too quiet. It was in those details, in those unspoken moments, that Clara realized Emily needed more than care. She needed companionship, joy, and someone who dared to see beyond her disability. Clara began in small ways. She would sit with Emily while folding laundry, humming softly until Emily started to hum along. She noticed that Emily's face lit up when she told silly stories about her own childhood, so she told more of them, exaggerating little details just to draw out a smile. But it was the day she playfully twirled around while dusting, pretending to be a clumsy ballerina, that everything shifted. Emily's laughter erupted, bright and unrestrained, and Clara realized she had found a way to reach her. From that day on, dancing became their secret ritual, their language of joy. It wasn't perfect or graceful. Clara was no dancer, but the way she spun and bowed and moved with abandon was enough to turn Emily's quiet afternoons into bursts of happiness. What Clara gave Emily was not just entertainment. It was freedom. Freedom from the weight of being seen only as fragile, from the pitying glances of outsiders who treated her like porcelain. Clara did not see a disabled child. She saw a girl who loved to laugh, who wanted to clap to a rhythm, who deserved to feel included in the simplest joys of life. Through her dance, Clara gave Emily a world where her wheelchair did not define her, where she was just a child enjoying the magic of the moment. For Emily, this bond became a lifeline. Her father's world was vast and filled with everything money could buy, but his absence left her feeling small and forgotten. Clara filled that gap with her presence, her time, and her laughter. It was in Clara's company that Emily rediscovered her voice, her ability to smile without forcing it. For Clara, the bond was healing too. She had lost her husband years ago and was left to raise her son on her own. Life had taught her resilience, but it had also taught her loneliness. Working in the mansion was her means of survival, yet in Emily she found a connection that went beyond duty. She found purpose in the way Emily's eyes sparkled at her antics, in the way the girl reached for her hand as if she were family. Clara, who had come to the mansion for work, now stayed for something deeper, for the bond that reminded her she was still capable of giving love and receiving it. The bridge of joy Clara built between herself and Emily did not go unnoticed. The house staff whispered about how Emily had changed, how her laughter echoed more often. Some wondered if Clara was overstepping, but even they could not deny the transformation. It was as if a light had been switched on inside Emily, one that no one had been able to ignite before. Clara became more than just a maid. She became the heart that brought warmth to a home that had been too cold for too long. When Richard stood in the doorway that night and saw Clara dancing, he realized the depth of her impact. It humbled him to know that the joy he had been unable to give his daughter came so naturally from someone else. The bond between Clara and Emily forced him to confront the truth love and presence mattered more than any wealth he could offer. Clara had stepped into the role he had neglected, not as a replacement, but as a reminder of what his daughter truly needed. That realization shook him, but it also gave him hope. If Clara could bring such joy with nothing more than her time and sincerity, then perhaps he could learn to do the same. Clara's role in Emily's life became a silent lesson for Richard. He began to observe the little things she did. The way she bent down to Emily's eye level when speaking, the way she never rushed her, the way she listened intently as if Emily's words were treasures. He saw how much difference it made, how it gave Emily confidence and a sense of worth. It dawned on him that the bridge Clara had built was not one of grand gestures, but of consistent, genuine care. It was not built with wealth, but with presence. And in that, Clara became not only a maid but a teacher, showing him how to reach his own daughter's heart. The beauty of their bond was that it was effortless. Clara did not dance for recognition or reward. She did it because she cared. She did it because she understood the loneliness of silence, the ache of feeling unseen, and she refused to let Emily feel that way. In a world where wealth often dictated value, Clara's presence proved that true worth lies in love and humanity. Emily cherished Clara because she made her feel like a child, not a patient, not a burden, just a girl who deserved laughter. As the days passed, Clara's role became indispensable. She remained gentle yet firm, loving yet respectful of boundaries, always careful to let Emily's spirit lead. She was the bridge that not only connected Emily to joy, but also reconnected Richard to his daughter. Through Clara's influence, the walls of the mansion began to change, not physically, but emotionally. Where there had once been silence, now there was laughter. Where there had been emptiness, now there was warmth. And all of it stemmed from one woman who had nothing material to give but gave everything of herself instead. For Richard, change did not come easily. He had built his life around discipline, order, and the endless pursuit of success. To him, vulnerability had always seemed like weakness, something a man of his stature could not afford. He was used to commanding respect, to making decisions with authority, to being in control. But when he stood in that doorway watching Clara dance for Emily, something inside him began to unravel. He realized that the world he had carefully constructed was missing its most important foundation: connection with his daughter. Yet knowing it and living it were two different things. The struggle began the moment he decided to step closer, to not only provide but to actually be present in Emily's world. At first, he didn't know how to start. He would enter her room, sit by her side, and try to spark conversation, but the words felt clumsy on his tongue. He asked about her day, but his voice carried the tone of a businessman conducting an interview rather than a father genuinely interested in his child. Emily, though polite, responded with short answers, unsure how to interact with a man who had always been more absent than present. Richard felt the weight of every silence that followed, the awkward pauses that reminded him how much distance lay between them. Breaking years of emotional absence was not as simple as showing up. It required something far harder: tearing down the walls he had built around himself. Richard's greatest battle was with his own pride. For years, he had convinced himself that being a good provider was enough. To now admit that he had failed as a father was to admit that all his sacrifices, all his late nights and long hours, had missed the mark. He wrestled with guilt, with shame, and with the fear of rejection. What if Emily no longer wanted him close? What if she had grown used to his absence and no longer needed him? These questions gnawed at him every time he tried to reach out, making his efforts hesitant, fragile, and easily discouraged. Yet Emily, with her gentle heart, began to respond in ways that encouraged him. The first time he attempted to read her a story, stumbling over the words because it had been so long since he'd read aloud, she giggled softly and told him he sounded funny. That small moment of laughter gave him courage. The next evening, when he asked her to teach him one of the songs she liked, she patiently guided him through the lyrics, her face lighting up as he tried to follow along. With each attempt, Richard felt pieces of his old armor falling away. He realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the only way to truly connect. Still, the process was far from smooth. There were days when work tried to pull him back, when the temptation to bury himself in meetings seemed easier than facing the awkwardness of rebuilding a bond he had neglected. On those days, Clara reminded him gently but firmly of what was at stake. She would tell him how Emily waited for him, how her eyes sparkled when she knew he was staying home, how his presence mattered more than he could imagine. Her words anchored him, pulling him back from the habits of his old life. Slowly, he began to understand that the world would not collapse if he stepped away from it for a while, but Emily's world would collapse if he didn't. The emotional walls he had built over decades had deep roots. As a child, Richard had grown up in poverty, with parents who struggled just to put food on the table. Love, though present, was often overshadowed by hardship. He learned early on that survival meant suppressing emotions, focusing on work, and never letting vulnerability show. That mindset had propelled him to success, but it also left him emotionally distant, unable to express tenderness without feeling exposed. Now, with Emily, he had to relearn everything. He had to allow himself to be soft, to be open, to be the kind of father who hugged without hesitation, who laughed without restraint, who cried without shame. There were moments when he faltered. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, he returned home tense and impatient. Emily asked him to join her for a simple card game, but he brushed her off, muttering that he was tired. He saw the disappointment in her eyes, and it pierced him deeply. Later that night, he stood outside her room, torn between pride and regret. Finally, he entered, sat beside her bed, and apologized. The word felt foreign on his lips, heavy with all the times he should have said it before. Emily, with the grace only a child could have, forgave him instantly, her small hand resting on his as if to say she had never stopped wanting him there. That forgiveness became his strength, reminding him that though he had been absent for years, it was not too late to change. The breakthrough came during a quiet evening on the balcony. Emily asked him to tell her a story about his childhood. Richard hesitated at first, ashamed of the poverty he had once hidden from the world. But as he spoke of the small house he grew up in, the struggles his parents endured, and the dreams he carried, Emily listened with rapt attention. For the first time, he shared a part of himself he had kept locked away, and in her eyes, he saw admiration rather than pity. That moment broke the last of his defenses. He realized that vulnerability connected them more deeply than any gift or luxury ever could. By opening himself up, he gave Emily permission to see him not just as a father, but as a human being, flawed but willing to love. The more walls he broke down, the more Emily blossomed. She began to speak more, to laugh louder, to reach for him without hesitation. He discovered that her joy was contagious, that her laughter healed wounds he didn't even know he carried. In teaching himself to be vulnerable, he found strength he had never known, the strength to prioritize love over pride, connection over control, and presence over perfection. Clara watched quietly from the background, smiling as father and daughter began to rebuild what had once been broken. She knew the journey was far from easy, but she also knew that Richard was learning the most important lesson of his life. That true strength lies not in walls, but in the courage to let them fall. Emily's health had always been fragile, but as Richard began to spend more time with her, he discovered just how much strength it took for her to live each day. Her condition meant that even simple tasks were exhausting. Some mornings she woke with enough energy to smile, laugh, and play, but others left her so weak she could barely lift her head. For a long time, Richard had distanced himself from this reality. He paid the best doctors, arranged treatments, and believed that by funding her medical care, he was fulfilling his role. But sitting by her side, watching her breathe heavily after the smallest effort, changed everything. He began to see that money could not shield her from pain, that wealth had no power over her body's limits. This realization weighed heavily on him, because for a man used to solving problems with resources and influence, here was one battle he could not control. The first true test of his resolve came on a night when Emily's breathing grew shallow. Her face paled, her lips trembled, and panic filled the air. Clara rushed to her side, calm but urgent, guiding her through the breathing exercises the doctors had recommended. Richard, however, felt helpless. He stood frozen, his hands shaking, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out his thoughts. For the first time, he was confronted not as a businessman or a provider, but as a father who could do nothing but watch his daughter suffer. He knelt by her wheelchair, tears stinging his eyes, and whispered promises that he would never leave her, that he would give up everything if only she would be all right. In that raw, terrifying moment, he understood the depth of his love for her, a love far greater than any empire he had built. Emily eventually stabilized, her breathing slowing as Clara comforted her. Richard held her hand long after, unable to let go. That night, he did not return to his office or pick up his phone. Instead, he sat awake beside her, listening to each breath, fearing that if he looked away for even a second, she might slip from him. The hours dragged, but in those hours he realized something profound. He had been living under the illusion that he controlled life, when in reality, life could change in a heartbeat. His daughter's fragility became his greatest teacher, reminding him that every moment with her was precious and fleeting. As days passed, Richard faced more of these difficult nights. Emily's health did not always follow a predictable path, and there were times when her laughter from the evening would fade into exhaustion by morning. These challenges carved into Richard's heart, forcing him to confront his own fears. He feared losing her, feared that no matter how much love he poured into her life now, it might never erase the years he had missed. But he also realized that fear could not stop him from showing up. If anything, it pushed him to be more present, to seize every moment he could. Clara often reminded him of the importance of joy even in the face of hardship. She encouraged him not to wrap Emily in sorrow or pity, but to make her days brighter with laughter and warmth. Richard struggled with this at first because his instinct was to protect, to worry, to shield her from everything. But Emily herself showed him that she wanted more than pity. She wanted to be seen as strong despite her weakness, as capable despite her limits. She did not want to be the fragile girl hidden away in a mansion. She wanted to live fully in the ways she could. Watching her spirit shine through her challenges humbled Richard. He realized she had more courage in her fragile frame than he had ever shown in his towering success. One particular evening left an imprint on him forever. Emily asked him to wheel her outside to the garden. It was late and the stars were scattered across the sky, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him and said, "Daddy, do you think the stars are people we loved who are watching us?" Richard swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the innocence and depth of her question. He wanted to give her an answer that would comfort her, but all he could manage was to pull her closer and whisper, maybe those stars were smiling just for her. In that moment, he realized that her fragile health, though terrifying, had given her a wisdom far beyond her years, a perspective on life that he had never considered. The constant uncertainty of Emily's health tested him again and again. Sometimes she had to be rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night, and Richard would sit anxiously in sterile waiting rooms, his heart aching with helplessness. Other times, she surprised him with bursts of energy, asking to play games or listen to stories, and he would marvel at her resilience. These ups and downs made him more aware of the fragility of life, but also of its beauty. Every smile, every laugh, every shared glance became a victory worth cherishing. Through these struggles, Richard began to change how he lived. He no longer measured his days by meetings or deals closed. He measured them by the moments he spent with Emily, by how often he could make her laugh, by how many times he could see her eyes light up despite her struggles. He found himself learning patience, compassion, and gentleness, qualities he had once considered secondary to ambition. He began to see that true strength was not about building empires but about holding steady when life tested him, about being a source of comfort when his daughter needed him most. The fragility of Emily's health also brought father and daughter closer together. They shared secrets, dreams, and quiet moments that deepened their bond. Sometimes she would tell him her fears, and he would hold her hand, promising to face them with her. Other times she would tell him about her dreams, and he would listen with tears in his eyes, wishing he could give her the world but realizing that what she wanted most was simply his presence. In those conversations, Richard discovered a new kind of wealth, the wealth of love, trust, and connection that no money could buy. Each challenge Emily faced reminded Richard of the urgency of love. Her fragility forced him to confront the reality that nothing was guaranteed, that tomorrow was never promised. But instead of drowning in fear, he began to embrace the present with gratitude. He learned to see joy in the smallest things: her laughter at one of Clara's dances, her delight at the smell of fresh flowers, her fascination with the stars. These moments, fleeting yet powerful, became the treasures of his life, more valuable than any fortune he had ever earned. And as he walked through those long nights and difficult days, Richard's heart grew softer, his love deeper, his understanding clearer. Emily's fragile health, though painful, became the very thing that showed him the essence of life, its brevity, its beauty, and the power of love to give meaning, even to the hardest moments. Richard's transformation did not remain confined to the walls of his mansion. Once he began to understand the true meaning of presence and love, it changed the way he looked at everything in his life. For years, his company had been his kingdom, a place where ambition ruled above all else. He had demanded long hours from his employees, praised sacrifice over balance, and believed that family could always wait. But after discovering the joy his daughter found in the simplest moments, Richard began to question the culture he had built. He started to see the weary faces of his workers differently, recognizing that behind every employee was a father, a mother, a child waiting at home for love and attention. He could no longer ignore the cost of the values he had once glorified. The first step he took was small but symbolic. He announced new policies allowing his staff more time with their families, urging them to leave the office earlier, to attend school plays, birthdays, and dinners. Many were shocked by this sudden shift, but Richard spoke to them with a new kind of conviction. He told them that success meant nothing if it was not shared with the people who mattered most. His words carried weight not because they were polished or persuasive, but because they came from a man who had lived the emptiness of neglect and the richness of rediscovered love. The company culture slowly changed, and with it, so did the lives of those who worked for him. Employees began to feel valued not just as workers but as people, and Richard felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he was giving them the chance to experience what he himself had nearly lost. At home, the transformation was even more profound. The mansion, once a cold display of wealth, began to echo with warmth. Richard made it a point to spend time each evening with Emily, whether it was reading stories, sharing quiet conversations, or simply sitting by her side. Clara's son, who had once been shy around the grandeur of the house, now became a frequent guest at the dinner table, treated with kindness and respect by Richard himself. What had once been a place of isolation now grew into a space of community and belonging. The walls that had witnessed silence for so long now carried the sound of laughter, conversations, and shared meals. Richard also found himself looking beyond his own family, realizing that countless children lived lives much like Emily's. Lonely, fragile, often forgotten by a world too busy to notice them. With his resources, he began funding programs for children with disabilities, creating spaces where they could find joy, connection, and opportunity. These initiatives were not acts of charity for recognition, but genuine efforts to ensure that no child would feel unseen the way his daughter once had. He poured his energy into creating foundations that supported families, offering not just medical assistance but emotional and community support. For the first time in his life, he felt his wealth being used for something that gave back meaningfully, something that aligned with the lessons he had learned in his own home. His personal journey was not without its challenges. There were moments when old habits tried to resurface, when the lure of business threatened to distract him from his priorities. But each time he faltered, he thought of Emily's laughter the night he first saw Clara dance. That memory became his anchor, a reminder that no achievement in the world could compare to the sound of his daughter's joy. Whenever doubts or pressures arose, he returned to that image. The maid spinning clumsily, the child clapping with delight, and himself trembling in the doorway, realizing how far he had drifted from what truly mattered. That moment of awakening became the compass by which he steered his life. The people around Richard noticed the change. Friends who had once admired him for his wealth now began to admire him for his compassion. Business partners who once envied his empire now saw the peace in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter. He no longer measured his worth by the numbers in his accounts but by the strength of the bonds he nurtured. And in doing so, he inspired others to re-examine their own lives, to ask themselves whether they were truly present for the people who loved them. His story became one of quiet influence, touching hearts far beyond his immediate circle. Clara, too, became an inseparable part of this new chapter. Though she remained humble about her role, Richard often credited her for teaching him lessons he had never learned in boardrooms or books. He treated her with a respect that went far beyond employer and employee, acknowledging her as the one who had opened his eyes to the truth. Their relationship grew into one of deep trust and gratitude, a bond that reflected the power of kindness to transform lives. Clara's presence continued to bring joy to Emily, but now it also served as a reminder to Richard of the values he wanted to live by. Simplicity, sincerity, and love. Emily, though still fragile in health, flourished in spirit. Surrounded by latter affection and genuine attention, she grew more confident, more expressive. She no longer felt like a child confined by her condition, but like a girl whose voice and presence mattered. The bond between her and her father deepened to a level that neither of them had thought possible. Their conversations became filled with dreams and hopes, their silences filled with comfort and trust. For Richard, every smile from Emily became a treasure, every moment together a victory over the years he had lost. As time went on, Richard's transformation became a testament to what love can do when it is placed above all else. He had once believed his legacy would be his empire, his buildings, his wealth. But now he understood that his true legacy would be the lives he touched, starting with his daughters. His success was no longer measured in profits, but in the sound of laughter echoing through his home, in the joy of children whose lives were brightened by the programs he supported, in the simple yet profound connections he nurtured each day. The millionaire who once trembled in the doorway of his daughter's room had become a man transformed. The dance he witnessed that night had not only opened his eyes but had reshaped his heart. It had taught him that love was not something to be postponed, not something that could be replaced by riches, but something that had to be lived fully, fiercely, and every single day